This is a Dvar Torah on Parshas Ki Seitzei. It's in Sefer Devarim. This whole Sefer takes place in the last 30 days of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, when he is giving all kinds of laws and mitzvahs to the people. In fact, this entire Parsha pretty much consists of mitzvahs. They can really be divided into two types. One applies to man and woman to their fellow people. And the second type are, which even though we do them, the mitzvahs, commandments, because Hashem commands us to, they could possibly be understood by human logic. You then have a second set of mitzvahs that are beyond human ability to understand. First type is dealing with how to be good to your, as I said, to your neighbors, and also how to even be kind to animals. One example of that is you cannot take either the eggs or the young hatch little birds from the nest in front of its mother. You must wave off the mother first, and if it's promised, if one does that, one will live long in the land, promised long life, which the other one is keep it all out of aim, honoring your father and your mother. And we learn a number of things from this, that mitzvahs cannot be judged by what you can do with them, how easy or how hard, but they all have their own reward. The second type of mitzvah, as I said, is that of what is called laws that one cannot understand by natural means. One of them is sharpness. You cannot have a garment of woven threads of wool and linen together. You can then have, however, right after that, it commands that they can be next to each other, but they can't be interweaved. Same with grains. You can't mix grain with vines. In other words, Hashem has set a certain order to the world. You can understand it. Species, however, they're far more complex, and as I said, not something that will be worked out by human logic. There's also laws of marriage and many other laws. Now, what I'd like to focus on tonight is what seems at the beginning three unusual, to put it mildly, mitzvahs. The three mitzvahs we're talking about here are the mitzvahs of the captive woman, Esha Shefer Torah, Shekachta, the captive woman you seize, take. Second one is if one had two wives. In the times of the Chumash, even later on, one was allowed to have more than one wife. And they were saying if you had a son, firstborn son from the hated wife, and you had a firstborn son from a favored wife, the double portion that a firstborn son gets has to go to the older firstborn, which in this case would be that of the hated wife. And there's a third law of Ben Sora B'Mora, which briefly is dealing with the following. If you have a young and rebellious wayward son, that's between the ages of 13 and 13 and a quarter, and his parents want him, and about his behavior, he steals money from them to get wine and meat. And then after the parents warn him, he does this kind of stuff a second time. He's taken out to the city, to the judges at the gate, and after the parents testify, he is killed And this is what I would call preventative, because of protection of him in a sense, because this is what he's doing between 13 and 13 and a quarter. Just imagine what he'll be doing another 5-6 years as he'll graduate to much heavier crimes for which he'll suffer more in this world and the next world. And therefore he's this is what you call preemptive preventive punishment. Because the two things he did as such aren't normally capital offenses. What I'd like to focus on here is why are these three connected? Why are these first three mitzvahs in this parsha? And to really answer that, I'd like to turn to the captive woman and read a couple of verses. Ki teitza milchama al levecha nesanu Hashem Elokecha b'yadecha v'shavo shaviv. When you will go out to war against your enemies, and Hashem, your God, will deliver them into your hand, and you will capture his captivity. In other words, you make them prisoners. Rita ne'shaviyah, Ashes Yefeh v'toar. A woman who's beautiful and pretty and beautiful in form, and you shikachta v'lakachta lech leisha, and you will desire her. You may take her to yourself for a wife. And then there's some requirements you have to do. You have to bring her into the house. You shave her head and let her nails grow. She will remove the garment of her captivity from herself and sit in your house, and she should weep for her father and mother for a full month. Thereafter, you may come to her and live with her, and she will be a wife to you. But it should be that if you do not desire her, then you will send her on her own, but you may not sell her for money. And it concludes with Lo tamidba v'tachat Hashem einaha, and you will not enslave her because you have afflicted her. Now, there's a number of questions on this mitzvah. First of all, why this was dealing with normally with wars of expansion. That means beyond the borders of Eretz Canaan, further away places. And second of all, these laws only applied in the time of when the Jewish people entered, this particular law entered the Eretz Canaan, and led by Yeshua after Moshe's death, primarily through the first temple area till the destruction of the first temple hundreds of years later. And these women were sent to the battlefield to try to entice and distract the soldiers. And it raises a very good question. Why would these men, these soldiers, be interested in these women, attracted these women? Now, Rashi explains is because that men have a Yetzirah, an evil inclination, and they're going to be tempted in the pressure of the battlefield. So as a concession to that, they're allowed to take them. Now, based on the Orach Chaim HaKodesh and Likutei Torah, there's a number of problems with this approach. Not that I'm saying it may not apply in some cases, is that these men, these soldiers that went out in those days, only the ones that were totally free of sin, as explained in last week's parsha, have no fear of sin, no fear of being punished, to go out into these battles. And they were tzaddikim, righteous people, Gomorrah, completely righteous people. So this particular group of people wouldn't have a Yetzer Hara, an evil inclination for such women. And even more so, the question that remains here, why would this captive woman and this soldier, righteous soldier, be allowed to cohabit once on a battlefield? That's another issue before she's taken home and given time to mourn her family. And as is explained, and I have to do a little background on this. This concept actually originates in time of Adam Rishon, the first man. All of the souls, all the sparks of the holy souls originate with him and through him, and there's the first two sons, Cain and Hevel. And if that's the case, if he hadn't eaten with Chava from that piece of fruit, Yisadas Tov and Ra, and evil hadn't been able to get power in the world, then we would have had, we were going to go on Eden, everything would be complete. When Adam committed that sin, many of the soul sparks, the Neshama, holy sparks, were going to be souls of people that went down and fell into what are called the klipot, the forces of spiritual impurity, because only with sparks of Kedusha of these holy souls were they able to be powered. Impurity without some contact, some power drawn from purity, Kedusha, holiness, could not function. Now, that being the case, what is going on here is something a little different. And since these were Siddiqim Gemorim, when did they with this women? And again, this is something that only applied at that time to people on such a spiritual level that we can't conceive of it. When he was with this woman, first cohabited with this woman the first time, if she was a person who had a spark of holiness, one of these holy souls, mixed in with a lot of impurity, and her spark of Kedusha was meant to be attached to the man, was relevant to this particular man, then all of her impurity would leave and her righteous soul would come out, and it would be a good marriage. And none of these problems of Ben Sora Gomorrah and the hated wife would occur. And she would become a righteous convert, and everything would be fine. Now, as the Or Chaim explains, when did the problems come? Is when he still wanted to keep her for her physical attractiveness, even after he realized she did not have a soul spark, a pure one, at least one that was Nogea relevant to him, and he still kept her for other reasons because he was physically attracted to her. Then one would get the Ben Sora Mora, the rebellious son, coming from such a union of these two, this man and woman. And before that, who would the hated wife be? It would be this captive woman who was a wife, but she eventually committed sins, not where she wasn't the right partner for him. And she would, at that point, be you'd face all these negative consequences. Now, taking this interpretation, the Or Chaim then answers another famous question. The Nevi'ah Ruth, who appears in Megillus Ruth, there's a question. To summarize the story briefly, Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and his two sons, Malchon and Kilion, went to Moab. In today's terms, when there was a fast, when there was a famine in Israel, it would roughly be equivalent of some major rabbi, his wife and sons wound up defecting to Iran and taking residence up there. Ultimately, Elimelech died. Then the two sons each took wives who were a princess of Moab. One of whom was Ruth, who was in fact a righteous woman. However, the question was, if she was, her gerus, her conversion was not a full conversion because it didn't meet all the requirements, how could Boaz later come to redeem Machlan and his property and take her as a wife? But there's no obligation to do so with a woman who's not Jewish. And the Orach Chaim wants to answer that question based on this, because what was going on here, what was happening was what's called the mitzvah yibum, which also appears in this week's parsha, where a couple are childless and the husband dies. It's the obligation of the brother take his sister-in-law as a wife, and the first baby will be named after the deceased brother, and in that sense his soul will come back. It's a very deep subject in its own for another time. In any event, it's a spiritual concept. It's a spiritual form of marriage. We're not allowed to do it now. Instead, if a situation does come up, chalitza is done where the woman goes to the Beis Din, religious court, and says he does not want to marry, he does not want to do yibum with me, takes off his sandal, and that releases from any obligation to him. And with that, we can answer your question, Ruth. Since yibum is a highly spiritual concept, since she had this Jewish, this sparks of kedusha, the spark of holiness of a very holy soul that came through her father by her Abraham, by her father Lot, they were in a spiritual sense, Machlan and Ruth, married, and therefore it could be that was enough of a marriage at that time, and in those circumstances, people were very high level of holiness, just so that she could be redeemed, and he could do yibum. She could be redeemed through Boaz, and these are very special concepts, but it's also a guide that we're not at that level, but we should try to be as pure as all the mitzvahs, commandments in this parsha allow. Good Shabbos and Shabbat Shalom.